Welcome to the 8th talk of Human Factors in Design. My name is Joseph Giacomin, and today we'll be talking about psychophysics and memory. So very important human characteristics involved in everything we do and everything we decide. So first of all, let's give some background to some of the words used in psychophysics. It's important to clarify and separate because quite often designers will use these terms fairly interchangeably, but they actually refer to slightly different things. So, sensation. Sensation is the conscious experience we get when we actually perceive something in the environment, either through our seeing, vision, or our hearing of sound, touching, smelling, and so forth. So sensation means that our brain recognizes that something's happened. It hasn't necessarily made much sense of it yet or organized the information yet, but it's aware that something's happening. Instead, once we start to organize, put edges on things, start to give shapes to things, start to notice differences in color and so forth, then we're referring to perception. The conscious experience of things and their relationships to other things. So perception is when the sensation starts to get shaped and starts to be compared, one bit of the image to the other bit, and we start to make sense of things. And then finally, the word cognition is used a lot in design. Cognition is when we've processed the sensation, we've formed a perception, and we've made sense of it. So at the end of the day, the previous two images were images of the scene of a dog, a Dalmatian, against the background of the shadows of a tree on the ground. And once we've got it, it's a dog, that's referred to as cognition. And the frontal cortex, where we do much of our thinking, where we say there's a dog and the dog is doing this and how should I react to it, that's referred to as cognitive processing or cognition. So what is this psychophysics then? If these are some of the key terms, what are we referring to? As the word suggests, psychology and physics together, interdisciplinary. Psychophysics is the study of the functional relationships between the physical properties of some stimuli, vision, hearing, smell, taste, taction, or touch. It's the relationship between these properties, these things that generate electrical signals that go to the brain, and the psychological responses to them, such as color or sound loudness or so forth. So, in psychophysics, there's a number of things which designers routinely consider and give some thought to. One of these, very important, is the perception threshold. The perception threshold is defined as the minimum quantity of the energy, whether it's light, sound, smell, whatever, the minimum quantity of that energy needed for a person to detect that there's something there. And the fact that there are things that are below this that are actually happening but we're not noticing it is been known for a long time. And in the 1860s, Fechner and other people who were active in what today we call psychophysics, they did a lot of work on these things and defined a lot of properties and did a lot of experiments. And one of the definitions Fechner provided, which is generally used today, is the stimulus threshold is that value which lifted the sensation or sensory difference over the threshold of consciousness. So if I talk really loud, softly, and you don't hear me, I can make sound that's there, it's measurable, the microphone picks it up, but you may not hear anything at all. So there's a threshold above which, from that point on, you know something's going on. Below that, the scientific instruments pick something up, but we are not aware of it. Now, the perception threshold is not a simple scientific on and off property. It varies for any sensory or stimulus modality, it varies from person to person. Some people have better hearing, some people have sharper vision, some people can smell things that other people are not picking up, and so forth and so on. So if we look at the issue, it's as shown in this diagram here. On the x-axis, we have the intensity of the stimulus. This diagram and most of the ones we'll be seeing today, we just have intensity of the stimulus. We don't necessarily have which stimulus, sound, vision, light, smell, touch, pressure, and so forth. We're not putting the actual stimulus, and we're certainly not putting the units. Why is that? Because these laws or rules are generic to all of them. This is happening with all of the sensory modalities we have. So we're just plotting stimulus intensity in simple normalized numbers against, on the y-axis, something of interest. In this case, for the threshold, we're talking about the proportion of people who said, yes, I heard something, with respect to the total number of people involved in the test. And as you can see from the data points on the diagram, we get what we usually get in physics and psychophysics, which is an S-shaped curve. Below some minimum intensity near the zero, nobody is aware that something is happening. As the intensity goes up and up and up to what here is listed as 1 or 100, as 7, which is the maximum, we end up with what's listed here as 1 or 100% of the people are picking it up. So at some point the sound is so loud that everyone involved in the test will have heard it, or the light is so bright everyone would have realized it's on. So we get a statistical distribution. It changes a little from person to person. The key point here is it's not an absolute. And what do we do in practice? What are you going to find as a designer when you open up the handbook and look for the threshold of vibration perception or threshold of smell perception or something for the problem you're designing? You'll find numbers in tables, and what they are is what's shown here on the left, the 50th percentile value, that middle point on the diagram. So to put a single number in a simple way in a table for everyone to use, usually in most cases, unless it's specified differently, it'll be the 50th percentile value as shown here. Keep in mind, though, that we don't want to design things too close on these numbers, because the reality is the curve you're seeing in this diagram. Another word of warning, not only is there a curve or a statistical distribution caused by the fact that people can be different, they might be different in their size. Big people and small people have slightly different susceptibilities to things like vibration. People vary in their gender. Boys and girls have differences in almost all the sensory modalities, as we saw with color blindness in a previous talk. Because there can be differences, large differences, we have to ask ourselves, how large might these differences be? And in this slide, we have an indication of the kinds of things that happen in practice. For various studies of vibration, such as seats on an airplane, in a car, something like that, it's very common, it's been commonly demonstrated by research studies that between the most sensitive person in the group who notices a threshold right away at a very small amplitude and the least sensitive person who doesn't notice it so quickly, there could be a difference of 5 times or 500%. So the first person is noticing a vibration at a level of vibration that's only 1/5 that required by the person who's least sensitive. So many sensory modalities have quite substantial differences, vibration being a good example of that. You must, as a designer, consider the fact that this is happening. You don't want to rely on warning signals, feedbacks, sensory stimuli which a person needs to do something, to understand something, to have situational awareness. You don't want that to be a stimuli which can be potentially close to their threshold of perception. Now, not only do people have a threshold on amplitude, how big something must be to notice it, I think that's rather intuitive. We sort of expect that. I think most people would have expected that. One thing most people don't stop to think about, and it might not be nearly as intuitive or nearly as expected, is the fact that the exact same thing happens with time. We do not manage to process time as a continuous analog stream. We actually take time in chunks, little pieces of time, just like a digital computer. And these kinds of issues were quite elegantly illustrated in the 1950s by various experiments. For example, the one cited here in 1955, Strode suggested that physiological time is not a continuous dimension, but rather discrete bits of time are involved, and he called them perceptual moments. Perceptual moments have been studied and restudied over the decades in a whole range of tests involving a whole range of stimuli and situations and different people of all sorts. And it always turns out to be something similar. There's a minimum chunk of time we can process and make sense of. It's something of the order of 25 to 100 milliseconds, where 100 milliseconds, of course, is 1/10 of 1 second, so fairly small slice of time. Most of the time the tests are coming in closer to 100 milliseconds than to 25, but that's the range that has been noted in various experiments. You can consider it to be a cycle time of the brain to loop around and check all the data, do all the calculations, and make sense of things before it can take on the next piece of sensory information. Now, perceptual moment. It's important to understand that two or more sensory signals, two or more sounds, two or more lights, maybe I flash a red light and then I flash a green light, two or more sensations which occur in less than the perceptual moment, less than 1/10 of a second, they can't be fully understood. They can't really be totally separated and analyzed. The brain merges them together, mixes them up statistically, and can't really make full sense of what's happening. An elegant experiment illustrating this was the one done by Efron in the 1960s. You can read what it says here at the bottom. 10 milliseconds of red light was flashed onto the wall in a dark room, followed on the same spot by 10 milliseconds of green light, or the other way around, first the green, then the red. It didn't matter which order it was done in. In both cases, when they asked the people, what did you just see? What color was the flash of light that we just projected on the wall during the experiment? In either case, regardless which was first and which was second, the person said, I saw yellow. Yellow being red plus green mixed together in equal proportion gives you yellow. So perceptual moments are very important. You can think of things like sports. If you're a fan of running sports, such as at the Olympics, the 100 meters, 400 meters, and so forth, you'll be aware that there's a starting pistol, and they shoot it and they make a sound, and then the person jumps off the blocks and starts running. They have cameras on the athletes. Anyone who moves their legs and starts to get off the block within the first 100 milliseconds, the first 1/10 of a second from when the sound was measured, that person is labeled as having made a false start and is either they repeat the thing if several people did it, or that one person is disqualified. So in sports, the perceptual moment is an integral part of the checking of the fairness of several different types of events, because the fact is, physiologically, we're all very similar, and we can't get beyond this limitation, which is the cycle time of processing of the human mind. Now, after the perceptual moment on the size of the thing, and the fact that time is being chunked and we have to consider that things that are too close together maybe is creating confusion, can't be separated, we then have to ask ourselves what else happens when a person responds to some sort of a stimulus. And the very next level of complexity is what's referred to as reaction time, as described here in this slide here. There are two main types. There's what's referred to as simple reaction time, and there's what's referred to as choice or complex reaction time. In the first case, you're sitting there, there's probably some sort of a test, probably there's a great big button in front of you, something is happening, and you're asked if you see something or hear something or if you manage to touch it. If there is a stimulus, hit the button and let us know you've noted it. And we measure how long that takes. Project the color, how much time passes before we hit the button. In the case of choice reaction time, as you can imagine the name suggests, you have more than one choice. So maybe there's a button for the letter A and a button for the letter B and C and D and E and F, and maybe on the wall we're projecting letters. And they project the letter, maybe C, and you have to choose which one it is and push on the button that says C. Choice reaction time takes longer because there's more thinking involved. It's not just a simple instinctive reaction. There's a bit of thinking to check what that is, to interpret it, and decide which of the options is available. Both types of protocols have been widely done for hundreds, if not thousands, of people in various scenarios, and much has been learned from these sorts of tests. For example, useful information. Simple reaction times always tend to behave like what's illustrated again in this diagram below. Stimulus intensity, again we have just a generic label of intensity, this time in decibels from 0 to 100. It's been calculated logarithmically. On the left hand side we have the median reaction time, median being the statistical value similar to the mean or the average, the median reaction time in milliseconds from 1 to about 350, 400 milliseconds. And what we see is this: if we're projecting a light onto the wall in a dark room and the test participant has to just push a button and say, yeah, I saw the light, if we're at the top end of this diagram near 100, where it's really bright, really bright, the reaction is very quick. The only thing slowing me down is how long it takes to move my hand, really. So you can see at the top part of the diagram, from a certain amplitude, maybe 50, 60 decibels in this particular example, from about 50, 60 decibels upwards, the time is about the same. There's very little difference because it's mostly how long it takes me to move and push the button. But as we drop and how bright the light that's being projected gets less and less and less, it gets harder to be sure whether it's really on or not. So we see that as the intensity of the stimulus drops towards zero, the amount of time it's taking the person to make a decision is going up and up and up and up, which is illustrating the point, which is for safety and for efficiency, as a designer, you want to make sure that you respect the human factors requirement of using stimuli whose intensity or amplitude is big enough in all of the circumstances in which the artifact will be used. Make sure it's big enough to always be evident and obvious, meaning on the right hand of this diagram, so that the person can react quickly. If I'm driving a car and something fails in the oil pressure system, a lack of oil in the engine can grip a cylinder, grip a piston, and blow up the engine. That's the end of my engine. So there's always an oil warning light on the dashboard, which is off unless the oil pressure drops significantly. Then when it drops, the light comes on. As a designer, I have to be very careful to choose the light intensity produced by the LED or the bulb or whatever is the system we're using on that dashboard. We have to ensure that the intensity of that little warning light will be sufficient against a background such as a bright sunny afternoon in the summer, and there's lots of sunlight coming into the cabin of the car, and of course in other circumstances such as driving late at night when it's very dark. We have to look at all the issues of light intensity in the environment. We have to look at things like glare and shadows, and we have to ensure that regardless of the situation, we're somewhere on the right of this diagram because we don't want to be on the left. It's a bright sunny day, the light's not so strong, we're somewhere near what's shown as the zero on this diagram. I'm not really sure the light is on, I'm waiting to figure it out, I don't understand, and my engine blows up. So we don't want that to happen. So simple reaction time tells us a lot about things we have to be careful for in terms of design, and we always have to be careful not to be too strong to blind people or too loud a sound to upset people, but at the same time we can't afford to be on the left hand side of this diagram. Choice reaction time, as we said before, is when we project something or make a type of sound or some other type of sensory stimuli that needs interpreting, needs to make a choice as to which one it is. Here's a little table taken from a study from the 1800s by Friedrich Merkel, whose name you'll see a few times in the field of psychophysics. The table shows the reaction time for a simple test, either numbers, letters, or something else being shown, as a function of the number of alternatives. If I only show a number or not a number, that's one alternative. Two alternatives. I either show a 1 or a 2, a 1, 2, or 3, a 1, 2, 3, or 4. As we go down the list of alternatives, you can see very rapidly the reaction times are going up. And as a matter of fact, they're going up so rapidly that we have another one of these things called laws. And as I mentioned in a previous talk, in human factors ergonomics, when we have something called a law, implying it's universally applicable to all people in all situations, that's a pretty strong statement. This law is referred to as Hicks Law, first formulated in the 1950s. Hicks Law states that choice reaction time is a linear function of the amount of information present in the stimuli. The more complicated something is to interpret, the longer it's going to take. And the more of these options that are complicated to interpret, even longer it's going to take to react. So, moral of the story, as designers, make sure your interfaces, particularly with safety critical systems, are as simple and minimal and clean and basic as possible, because Hicks Law is stating in no uncertain terms, as you complicate the complexity of the stimulus, or if you provide more options to choose from in terms of what to react in that situation, meaning complicate the reaction part of it, in either case, you're lengthening the amount of time. And as we know, time is fundamental, because reacting quickly to a nuclear power plant that's starting to melt down, or to an airplane that's hit turbulence and has lost lift in the sky, or to a submarine who's gone beyond its dive limit, reacting quickly, sometimes a matter of a few seconds, can be a matter of life and death. So Hicks Law is very frequently referred to in design. Now, other psychophysical properties, another really important one for designers, just noticeable difference. And as the name implies, it's the minimum amount of difference that a person can notice. For example, if I have two pens or pencils and I hold them in my hands and somebody asks me which one is heavier, which of these two is heavier, that's a situation of the type we usually refer to as just noticeable difference. How much does one pencil have to be heavier or lighter than the other one for a human being to notice the difference? And interestingly enough, it's a very rigorous, a very well described characteristic of the human body. As a matter of fact, in the early 1800s, Ernst Weber, another one of the people whose name crops up very frequently in psychophysics. Weber did lots of tests, many of which were exactly like what I just described. They were about weight or mass differences. Others were differences in sound intensities, differences in the force of pulling or pushing something. So lots and lots of tests with different people to see how much he had to make something different before it would be easily noted by the people. And from lots of tests, hundreds of them with hundreds of people over a period of some years, Weber saw that the description of what's happening, the description of the data he's collecting, is always turning out to be the same. And what Weber defined is today referred to as Weber's law, which is what's illustrated here. The minimum difference, the just noticeable difference, the difference in size that some people refer to as the difference Lyman, L-I-M-E-N, the minimum delta I, the difference in the intensity of the stimulus that you can notice, any person can notice, is a constant number given by K, which is referred to as the Weber fraction, times the size of the stimulus. So if we have two of these, and one of them is just slightly less heavy than the other, the less heavy one gives me how many milligrams or grams it weighs, multiply it by the fixed fraction K, which we'll see in a moment. You can look it up in a table. Values that the Weber fraction can take on are illustrated on this slide that you have in front of you now. So we see some types of stimuli, some modalities. It doesn't take much to notice the difference. For example, electric shock, 0.013 for the Weber fraction, 1.3% difference. So one electricity you touch, another electricity you touch, you only need about 1% difference in the two stimuli, and it can be noted that one is bigger than the other. Others a little bit less sensitive. You see here brightness, about 8 roughly percent, 0.079, 7.9% is almost 8%. So if we look at Weber's fraction from all the literature that's been accumulated over the last 100 and some years, we will notice that it's almost always somewhere between 1% and about 9%. So as a rule of thumb, if a designer thinks something can only be noticed to be different from something else, if the difference between the two is at least 7-9%, as a rule of thumb, that would be a reasonable rule of thumb to remember. And as a matter of fact, many times designers have this sort of figure in mind when they decide things. And it is important. For example, if your boss asks you, should we specify in the new version of our automobile the new dampers, shock absorbers for the suspensions? They're going to raise the cost of the car by a couple £100 because they're rather sophisticated, but they've led to a 4% reduction in vibration at the passenger seat or on the steering wheel. As a designer, you would have to question that decision and say, if the difference between the really expensive new possibility and the old one that was there last year is only about 4%, 5%, something like that, it's not guaranteed that a driver or a passenger would even note that value, because we know that all human people with psychophysics have a Weber fraction or a just noticeable difference somewhere from 1 to 9%. Maybe somebody might notice it at 4% difference, but it looks a lot like we've just added a lot of expense to our product, which is going to discourage some purchasers, and it's not even guaranteed that most people would even notice that there was any difference at all. This is a consideration which occurs routinely in design, because there's absolutely no point adding complexity and cost to products or services unless it's absolutely sure that people will notice that there's a difference. Now, moving on with psychophysics, beyond the Weber fraction, which is the minimum difference that we can notice, there's other important characteristics which are incredibly useful, which designers often give some thought to. Another one is another law, Stevens' law. Again, 1950s. A lot of these tests and a lot of these conclusions were drawn after the Second War, again because of the acceleration in the research in human factors and ergonomics. In the 1950s, S.S. Stevens in the United States did a lot of tests where they changed the weight of something, how big something is, how much it weighs, or they changed the sound loudness of something, or they changed the brightness of the light that's being shown, and they asked people to rate the values with a scale, for example, from 1 to 10, or from 1 to 10, or from 0 to 100. So they were direct sensory ratings of the stimuli. So we produce something, we have a participant there, we leave it a few seconds for the participant to be sure they understand what's happening, and then we say, on a scale from 0 to 100, how strong was that light? 80, 70, 60? On a scale from 0 to 100, how loud was that sound, that sine wave? 50, 60, 70, whatever. And we had direct ratings of perceived or subjective intensity. Those tests produced a large number of data sets from all kinds of people in all kinds of situations for several different modalities of stimuli, and Stevens looked at them all and said, I think mathematically we can describe all the data points in all the data sets reasonably well. Of course, there's always some noise in the test, but reasonably well with a power law. And this is referred to, what we refer to today, as the Stevens power law. The sensation that the person's having, meaning how big's the number they're saying, 10, 20, 50, 80, 100, the sensation, the subjective feeling they got, is equal to some constant alpha, which is related to how the test was done. It's just a fixed number, it's not particularly insightful, times the intensity of whatever it was we were showing or doing, raised to a power, m. And the interesting part is the power m. The power m, depending on what number fits that best for a given data set, that changes quite significantly what's going on. And the power constant m, the value of this m that they fit and they found for different data sets from different experiments, depending on the value of m, you can describe a rather different human response. For example, if m is equal to 1, anything raised to the power of 1 is just itself. So it's a straight line. The feeling s is equal to some constant, and that's not the interesting part, it's just a fixed number, times whatever it was we were showing, how big it was, measured in whatever units we were using. So it's just a straight line, and it's what's shown here on the diagram as the white line, apparent length exponent equals to 1. So it means if I double the intensity of the sound, the loudness, if I double the brightness measured with a light meter of the light, I will double what the person says they're feeling. But that's only some stimuli. Other stimuli, for example, if we look at brightness for light, the brightness, the exponent turns out from all the tests that have been done over the years, turns out to be a bit less than 1, something around 0.6, 0.7 often, something like that. So we have a flattening, not linear, non-linear curve. So when it's pitch black outside, middle of the night, no moon, if we put a little tiny light, even just a candle or a match, the people notice it very quickly. You see the curve grows very rapidly from 0 as soon as you move away from 0. But then as we make the light brighter and brighter and brighter and brighter, it doesn't really seem subjectively to be that much stronger than it was previously. Its growth starts to get to be less the bigger it is. So the brightness of light is nonlinear, curving towards a flat asymptote or a maximum increase you can achieve. Instead, electricity, anyone who's ever been shocked by the mains will be aware of this. Electricity instead is exactly the opposite. Electricity, when you fit the data from the data set, such as Stevens did, you will find the value of m that comes out of the regression fit, the mathematical fit of the data to get the numbers of the equation. You will find that that m is greater than 1. It means the feeling that people are getting is getting bigger the bigger it is. So we're growing faster than 1, faster than linear. So the bigger I make it, the faster the feeling grows. The bigger I make it, the even faster the feeling grows. And as you can see, for very small voltages, such as your 9-volt battery, you can short it out and not feel anything. But once you start to get to be 20, 30, 50 volts, you start to notice it. And by the time you get to the mains, it's incredibly dangerous. So with electricity, we have a nonlinear upwards growing, getting bigger, faster all the time. Whereas with light and brightness, it's still getting bigger, but it slows down its rate of growth as we get larger. And if we look at the values of the Stevens coefficient m, this very important number, we will see that there's quite a range of values for different stimuli. Sometimes the m is rather small. We see some values in the table, for example, 0.3, 0.5, 0.6, which means it flattens out quite a bit. Other times we have like electricity or heaviness or other stimuli in the table, also some types of vibration. Can be numbers bigger than 1, so they're actually growing rapidly, the feeling. And then there's a few things where it's easy for the designer, because you know that as you change the number, the person's response changes proportionally. For example, time duration, pressure on the palm of the hands, taste, temperature. We know that there's quite a few situations where you double what is the stimulus, you double the feeling the person has. Nice and simple, no need for translation with the equation. In those other areas, you have to take the machine measurement, whatever your sensor and your measurement system is telling you, and run it through the Stevens law to get what's the estimate of what the person's feeling. Now, as a design classic, for psychophysics, the specific topic of psychophysics, I'm just showing one, which is the traffic light. And as I've said previously, good design, great design particularly, tends to disappear from our consciousness. We don't stop and think a whole lot about the traffic light. But the traffic light, after roughly 100 years now, almost 100 years at this point, of use in mass production and mass use in our cities, the traffic light has become optimum from a psychophysical point of view and works brilliantly and is nice and simple, and no one pays any attention to it. But it has quite a few characteristics which come right from psychophysics. For example, the use of 3 different lighting elements. Not 5, not 7, not, the traffic light is simple. Occasionally these days you may have a timer as well, telling you how long it'll be before it flips green, but most traffic lights in the world are keeping things simple because choice reaction time and studies, which we'll see in a moment related to memory, confirm that the more complicated the stimulus is, the longer it's going to take to make sense of it, to decode it, and to make a decision. So nice and simple in terms of 3. In terms of the lighting intensities, the bulbs or the projection systems used over the years in street lights have been designed such that even on the brightest noontime, sunny afternoon in August, you still get enough light intensity out of the light to be well above the threshold of perception at many meters distance, not just the first car in the column, but maybe the fifth or sixth or seventh down the column waiting for the light to turn green. All of those first cars will get enough intensity of the light to ensure that they're far away from the perception threshold, and to ensure that certain particularly bright days with not a cloud in the sky and the sun in just the right position and so forth, to make sure that in certain scenarios it's still guaranteed despite a very intense glare. We have shields and coverings and other things to try to reduce the amount of sunlight which is directly impinging upon the color of the light itself. So the street lights have been optimized from a psychophysics point of view in terms of brightness, intensity. They've been simplified, which is also a psychophysics issue. And on top of everything else, the switching time considers a number of factors, including also the perceptual moment and how long it takes a person to decide to fully understand that the light has flipped. So this is a very good example of a design classic. It's something no one ever thinks about, but it optimizes a whole series of psychophysical considerations in a very simple, basic, and elegant manner. Moving on to the next topic, which falls under the heading of psychophysics and memory. Let's focus specifically now not just on the whole sensory process, but on the memory systems involved. Looking at the memory systems. Human memory, defining clearly what we're talking about. Human memory is a series of systems which store and retrieve information. They can range in terms of storage ability from something of only a few bytes, to use computer terminology, of information, to stimuli which are incredibly complex, such as whole speeches, which are kilobytes and megabytes of information. And human memory systems in terms of time can range from a matter of milliseconds, some of the systems, to other systems such as the ones that we remember things from the past with, which are our long-term memory. So memory systems can hold tiny amounts of data, some of them. Others instead work with very large amounts of data. Some of them can only hold the information for tiny amounts of time, and others instead can hold it perhaps for the whole lifetime of the individual. So memory, which is one word, is used commonly every day for a variety of purposes to refer to a variety of things, but in reality memory is a set of specific systems in the brain which do specific tasks, and they vary quite a bit. Now, looking at the different types of memory, the next few slides will describe different types of memory, different systems of memory, and talk about them using different names, explaining their characteristics, and probably mentioning some of their importance to human factors and ergonomics. These systems are distributed across the brain. Not always is it so straightforward to indicate, oh, here, right here on the cortex, this centimeter of cortex, this is where this memory system is. It's not always like that. But what they are a set of observations and names and definitions which come from what we see externally. When we put people to the test and we show them things or ask them to remember speeches or test them in some way, what does their recall and what does their response to our questions seem to indicate? These coming slides are systems which have been identified from things that we can notice about people from the outside. They are not referring necessarily to a specific region of the brain or a specific timing loop of the brain, though in some cases there are correlations. But what we're talking about here is psychologically, what can we say about the person's memory system from what we've seen on the outside when we put them in a certain situation. So the first thing that was noted some years back, and this is the 1700s, is it was noted that very surely, somehow, in the human mind, there is something which is today referred to as iconic memory. Iconic memory means visual memory of a very short-term nature. The kinds of experiments that were used to define this in the 1700s by Segner were often very simple things, such as I put a candle on a spot, I put a barrel or a drum over it on a turning wheel, and I spin it and spin the wheel around, and I make a hole in the barrel, and I look how fast I can spin it such that the hole goes around and comes to the candle again and again and again, and I look what's the effect of how fast I'm spinning the barrel on what I'm seeing. When I spin it very slow, I see nothing. The hole comes around again. I see the candle, very clearly the candle, the nothing, and then it comes, lines up the hole again. I see it. As I go faster and faster, my view of the candle starts to get blurred, and at some point it just disappears. I can't actually make out the candle clearly anymore, but I'm seeing a line of light, like a circle of light, like what's being shown in the picture to the right. So Segner did tests in which the speed of the turning of the barrel or the drum or whatever it was he used in a given test, the speed was controlled very accurately by his assistants, so he could measure it very carefully and see at what speed, what frequency, the view of the candle starts to get blurred and starts to disappear. And lo and behold, Segner noted that to see the candle clearly, you have to be going below a little bit slower than 100 milliseconds. So the time it takes for the hole to line up again and again and again. If I go slower than 100 milliseconds, I see quite clearly a candle goes off, candle's back, goes off. Above 100 milliseconds, I just see a blurring white line. And that, lo and behold, is again another demonstration of what we talked about a few minutes ago, which was the perceptual moment, about 100 milliseconds, a tenth of a second. That's the minimum we can grasp onto. Anything that's less time than that, meaning spinning faster than that, we just get a blur. So in the 1700s, the exact numbers were calculated, but the phenomena that is you spin things start to get blurred after a certain speed. That was already known in ancient times in antiquity. There's writings of the Greeks and Romans where they refer to this phenomena, this trick of the eye. In the 1700s, the numbers and the maths were run and the exact figures were demonstrated. The same way that vision is respecting this 100 milliseconds, and there seems to be a memory system hanging on to the data for about 100 milliseconds before it empties and takes on a new chunk of data. We have a very similar thing happening with sound, what's referred to as echoic memory. Here on the slide is a description of some tests from the 1960s of this, and in this specific set of tests, they found about 250 milliseconds, a little bit more than 2/10 of a second for this particular test. Some of that was related to the complexity of the test itself. So again, like the visual short-term, super short-term memory, the iconic, there's an echoic memory, which is again a super short-term, tenth of a second, 2/10 of a second roughly, memory, which is hanging on as best it can to the stimulus until the next loop of the brain processing, when it releases the information, takes on some new information. So echoic and iconic memories, and we presume there's the exact same kind of memory for smell and taste and so forth and touch. It must, by logic of the situation, be the same for the other sensory modalities. There's always going to be a little data buffer that lasts about 1 to 2/10 of a second, which tries to hold on to anything that happened during that period, such that the brain has time to reach that information, pick it up, do something with it, and make sense of it before it zeroes it out and takes on the next chunk of data. Iconic and echoic memories are about holding on to the information to give the brain a chance to think about it. Now, beyond the super short term, just to hang on to things long enough to make sense of the world, then is the next level of memory. There have to be some memory systems somewhere operating on what is referred to as short-term memory. Studies with letters, patterns, numbers, sounds, smells, tastes, all kinds of tests over the last 50, 60 years have come to the conclusion that somewhere in the human nervous system there's a set of connections and a set of neurons performing work which we refer to as short-term memory. Short-term memory is generally considered to be a system which operates over a period of time from about 2 seconds to about 20 seconds. So when I'm talking now, you will be able to recall exactly the word I said for a good 10, 15 seconds probably, after which you'll start to struggle as new things come in. As I say more things, you'll be struggling to recall and to remember what I said 10, 15, 20 seconds previously. So there's a short-term memory system which is incredibly important for us as we live our everyday life in everything we do. Short-term memory is a very big focus of design, particularly of human factors and ergonomics calculations. Now, short-term memory, there's hundreds of demonstrations and data sets which I could be showing to illustrate to you what it looks like. I'm just going to show this one diagram because I think it's very simple and clear to read. The delay of the cue along the x-axis, the percent correct detection, how many things the people said that were right on the y-axis. I'm not going to go into the detail of the test protocol because there's many different ways of doing these kinds of tests and they have slightly different effects on the numbers you see on the table. But the fact is, this diagram here is indicative of what you usually see as a shape, regardless of how you did the test, regardless if it was sound or whether it was light or whether it was touch or smell or taste. So what we're seeing here is a diagram which is indicating that the test they did, they were feeding information to the people, and then every now and then, by surprise, they would stop it and ask the person to repeat the last few things that were said. As you can see, the percentage of the things the people repeated that was right, that was correct, drops very rapidly when the words that are being asked to repeat, the ones that they had previously heard, were more than about 4 or 5 seconds before the point at which they stopped and asked for the repeat. So this diagram is suggesting that we're reasonably good, even though 25% detection on this diagram suggests the test was rather hard for the people, but people are reasonably good at hanging on to something someone told them or something they saw or something they were thinking for about 4 or 5 seconds. You can see the curve has relatively high values for the first 5 seconds, after which the curve starts to drop and then exponentially slowly goes towards zero. This is suggesting that as a designer, you don't want to be putting people in situations where they have to remember things for more than 10, 15 seconds before they need to use the information that they were hanging on to. It will drop out of their short-term memory after about 10, 15 seconds. And the amount of time that the person can hold something someone told them, something that the computer software said as the error message, the amount of time that the people can hold on to whatever type of stimulus it might be is also depending on how complicated that stimulus actually is. Again, a diagram, it's not important the experimental protocol, we're just trying to illustrate the shapes and the kinds of effects that come up time and time again, regardless of how you do the test. Here we have percent correct recall, that the people were able to repeat what they had heard or seen or said. And then we have how long after, in seconds, going up to about 9 or 10 on the x-axis. And we have different patterns. These were pixelated patterns that were projected on a wall, and the person then had to draw it or indicate it on a computer screen. We have pixelated patterns which are of different complexity. And what we can see is when we used a 4x4 or a 16 pixel image, and we showed an image where some of the pixels were in black and some were in white, and we asked the person, go and draw it and show us which one we had just showed you. Well, people are doing a reasonable job of repeating it. Up to about 9-10 seconds is still more than 70% correct at about 10 seconds. So when the stimulus was relatively simple, they were able to hang on to it longer in short-term memory, in their short-term memory system. When we go to 6x6 and ask a person to repeat something that complicated, the correct percent rate drops. And as we went to an 8x8, we're now getting beyond the complication a person could have dealt with even without having to recall it after many, many seconds. So the error rate after 1 second drops dramatically. So this image is showing typical work from the field of psychophysics and memory. But for a designer, what it's telling you is be very careful to keep your design simple and essential as much as possible. The more detail, the more complexity, and the more you're asking a person to remember, the harder it's going to be, and the differences can be quite dramatic. Therefore, don't be surprised if you offer 20 menu options on your main menu. Don't be surprised if the people are mistaking, they're getting the app, they're using it incorrectly over and over again when the first menu had 20 things to choose from and a person had to remember a lot of information to make that choice. So keeping menus, keeping graphics and visuals, keeping the aesthetics of things simple is about this. It's about accommodating human short-term memory abilities. And human short-term memory abilities are so fundamental in human factors, ergonomics, and design more generally, that it has its own name. It's got this rule, which is referred to as the 7 plus or minus 2 rule. And the 7 plus or minus 2 rule is a rule of thumb, which most designers, nearly all of them, keep in mind all the time, which is saying that a person is very unlikely for any period of time, for 10, 20, 30 seconds, is very unlikely to be able to hang on to information which involves more than 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information. So if I have a picture like the one that's shown now on the screen, and there's a variety of objects, there's several pieces of bread and toast, there's some with jam, some without, there's a knife, there's butter, there's a coffee, there's possibly a sugar jar, jam, and so forth. There's probably more than a dozen items on this screen. That is above or violating the 7 plus or minus 2. 7 minus 2 is 5, 7 plus 2 is 9. This has more than 9 objects on the screen. So if I turn away for 20 seconds and then somebody asks me what's on the table, I'll be lucky to get maybe 5 or 7 of them right, and the other ones I won't be able to recall them because my memory storage system wasn't capable of doing it. So making sure that when you design a menu system, when you provide options on the screen, when you have buttons on the dashboard of the car for the heater control, when you have buttons on some sort of a consumer good, when a designer chooses buttons, knobs, dials, screen options, menus, arrows, and other things, this is a rule memory, of cognition, which the person almost always keeps in mind when they're doing the designing. Now finally, for memory, long-term memory, because you will be thinking, okay, so I've got these super short systems which hang on for a few tenths of a second just to grab information to feed to the brain for processing. I've got short-term or working memory, it's also referred to as working memory, which can last perhaps up to 20 seconds. And most of my 2 + 2 = 4 type reasoning, or my I'll choose to put this on top of this other thing type reasoning, most of that will be done in short-term memory. But you're probably also thinking, but hold on a second, I can see those things in use, but I also know that I remember things from my childhood. And I remember very clearly the first time I went to the beach with my mom and dad, or my first car, or my first girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever. That's a different memory system altogether. And it's a very interesting one because it creates a lot of issues and a lot of problems. And that memory system, which is distinct from the ones we've been discussing up to now, that one is referred to as long-term memory. This is the memory that everyone generally thinks about as helping to recall things from hours, days, weeks, months, years, possibly decades previously. Now, a very elegant illustration of the workings of long-term memory, an illustration which will help to explain it much better than a couple thousand words that I might be able to produce, is the study by Nickerson from the 1960s. An old study, nothing particularly flashy, but very simple, clear, and understandable, really illustrates what's going on here. What did these chaps do? Nickerson went and collected a photo archive, which he put into a ring binder, a great big ring binder, containing 600 color photographs of various scenes and events. There might be trees, there might be the forest, there might be a car waiting at a stoplight, there might be a scene of someone doing their laundry. 600 images taken from everyday life, intended to be as wide-ranging as possible, a database of the kinds of things that we take in with our eyes and with our ears on a daily basis. The gentleman put these in a great big binder in a random order, and then rounded up some participants. Put the participants in a room and gave them a fixed period of time to flip through the pages one by one and look at each nice, pretty picture, nice, emotionally engaging picture, and try to commit it to memory. And the amount of time each person had for each image was the same, the room and the pictures were the same, everything was the same. So everyone was asked to commit these images as best possible to their long-term memory. Then Nickerson calls them back. He calls them back after an hour, after a day, after a month, after a few months, after a year, and he gives them a ring binder with pictures, a random mixture, and says, can you say yes or no for each picture whether it was one of the ones you saw before or whether you think it's a new one that I hadn't shown you previously? And the people go through, yes, this one, no, this one, no, this one. They go through it all till they finish it. Summing up the numbers over a large number of participants for this test with these many images, recognition, meaning getting the yes or no right, after one day, meaning when he brought them back the very next day, was 92%. That's pretty good. So 92% correct. Yes, that was one of the ones from yesterday, or no, that wasn't one of the ones from yesterday. When he brought them back further times over the course of time, the last time I think 1 year was the longest of the checks, and after 1 year, the correct detection was still high. It was 63%, as shown at the bottom of this slide. 63% is very far from random coincidence. Random coincidence, a random event like tossing a coin, heads or tails, is 50-50 if it's a fair coin. This is 63%. This is statistically quite significant. It's distant from random chance. So it appears that long-term memory is absolutely brilliant. However, that's not the case. And the problems, and there are many problems with this in design, in the court legal system, all kinds of problems in society, come from the fact that long-term memory is far from an accurate, reliable judge of what they saw or what they heard. One very elegant study, again, there's many that could be illustrated. One very elegant study of this was a 1983 study by Rubin and Contis. They went to a public location, they had a table, they had some circular sheets of paper with different bits and pieces, and they were doing a test of how well people in the United States of America were remembering the coins they used. Okay, please keep in mind that at the time there were no contact, there was no credit card, click the button. It was all transactions done by paper money and coin metal money. So people would be routinely walking around every day of their life with a set of coins in their pocket every day. People were growing up with these coins as part of their life, so they would have seen them millions and millions of times. So they put a table out, they had a great big circle, and they had bits and pieces, faces of the various presidents, words like "in God we trust," liberty, and so forth and so forth, 1 quarter, 1 dime, 5 cents, and so forth. And they had lots of words, and they had lots of faces facing one way or the other way of the presidents, because the American coins always have the presidents: Lincoln, Jefferson, Roosevelt, and George Washington. And they said to people, without looking in your pocket and without pulling out a coin, take the circle and put the pieces in to make me what is the 5-cent coin, which is the Thomas Jefferson one, the second one from the top. Make me the penny, the 1-cent coin, which is Abraham Lincoln, which is the one at the top. And what we have here on this slide in the first column is the real one. That's what they actually look like. The sizes are not like this. These are all the same diameter because this is what they did for the test. But what's written in the circle is the right one. And the one on the right is the modal value, which is similar to the mean, which is not very distant in this case from the average or mean value. The mean, the median, and the modal were all relatively close together in this study. It's, let's call it, the most typical response that the average person provided. Please note what's happening here. The real coins can have the presidents facing this way or facing that way. The real coins have phrases like "in God we trust" in different places, written in different ways with slightly different fonts. What the people constructed from their long-term memory of something they've seen probably every day of their life, their whole life, is they're all located, they're all facing in one direction. They've all got the statements "in God we trust" or the name of the coin in the same place, and they've all got the date in the same place. So what's happening here? What's happening is an illustration of what's been confirmed many times from neurological experiments, also with magnetic resonance imaging or positron emission tomography. Lots and lots of different scientific measurements in lots of studies for lots of purposes have seen over and over again that long-term memory is where your brain is saving on its synaptic connections at its neural synapses. It's changing the weights or changing the synaptic strengths to save a model of what you saw and what you heard and what you did, not the raw data of what happened. And this is an important, very important characteristic of human beings, which needs to be accommodated quite frequently. in design. This is what's behind quite often many of the biases that cognitive biases designers deal with when they design interfaces and so forth. Our brains save a model of the event, not the data of the real event. So I went to the beach for the very first time last year in some place in Europe. The water was lovely, the sky was perfect blue, all the local people were so friendly, the food had the best taste I've ever tasted in my life. I decided it was so good, I go back again this year to the same place, and I go there and the water doesn't seem very blue and the sky is not as clear and many of the locals are not nearly as friendly as I remembered, and the food doesn't seem any more special than anywhere else in that particular country. How did this happen? Did everything change from last year? No, it didn't. It's that our memory committed perfect, simplified, purified, filtered, noiseless versions of whatever it is we're trying to remember to our memory, whereas the raw data, the real experience, was much more noisy and much more colored and much more confused and less simplistic than that was. Now in design, this reinforces the requirement to keep interfaces and keep artifacts, products, systems, services, keep their operating models, their operating principles the same at every level of abstraction. So in every menu of the system, in every image we show, in every contact touch point we have with the artifact, a designer needs to ensure that the basic logic of what the person is seeing and doing remains as close as possible to the one of all the other touch points and all the other operations and all the other menus of the product. Consistency and simplicity is the only way to avoid serious mistakes occurring, possibly dangerous ones, with users due to this memory phenomena occurring here. And typical illustration of this, designers often try to recall the basic rule of thumb. Recognition is easy, but recall is hard. Recognition or detection being yes or no. Yeah, I think that's the one from last year. Recall being, and the date is here and the president was turned to the left and the statement is written at the top rather than the side. Recognition means I notice it's similar, I think it's similar enough, I think it's the one from yesterday. Recall is I can sketch it out and draw it and reproduce it in detail correctly. Not just recognize it's it, but I can draw it or explain it in detail correctly and how it works. I remember the mental model of it in detail. One is easy. Long-term memory can handle the first one quite easily. The second one's incredibly complicated. And a typical illustration is this. There's lots of products and lots of systems which are designed with a certain amount of nostalgia or a certain identity with previous examples from the same company or from the same product line. If we look at this particular vehicle here from a few years ago, most people would probably recognize, most Europeans at least would recognize quite rapidly that that's a Fiat 500. And most people would probably think back to when they were children, when there were quite a few of these still on the road, and maybe have some fond memories of their grandfather giving them a ride in one. So the detection or the recognition that this is probably a Fiat 500 and the styling and the decisions made by the designers to maintain that connection and create an emotional bond and a strength with the memory, that's straightforward. But if someone was asked to actually sketch out or draw what the original one that we're saying this looks like it, the original one, what was it in practice, what was it really, if someone had to draw it, who would remember all the details of this? This is the Fiat 500 that we think we recognize when we see this. So brands, particularly heritage brands who have a lot of business reasons for maintaining nostalgic, emotional, and brand identity connections with past practice or past products or past consumer offerings. Brands have to basically, to deal with the human long-term memory, they simply have to reproduce a few things, such as the curvature of the rear window here, the front two lights and the small face on the nose of the car, the somewhat rounded body shape. Only a small number of visual or semiotic cues are needed to maintain the connection with the long-term memory, given the long-term memory is remembering only the main characteristics of the model, not all the details of what they actually saw. So nostalgia or heritage brands quite often do not need to be that close to the original to bring them together in such a way that there is an identity, a continuity assumed by most people. Now, in terms of design classics, for memory systems specifically, I'm going to discuss the one system that possibly more than any other exemplifies a product or a service which is taking fully into consideration human memory systems, their capabilities, their time responses, and their main characteristics. And that's Wikipedia. You know, you may not have stopped to think about it very often, but now in the 21st century, with Wikipedia and other systems similar to it, we are all cyborgs. We do not have to recall things that happened last year or the year before or 100 years ago in any detail whatsoever. We don't have to commit it in fine detail to our memories, because all we have to do is carry around a cell phone, and when we need the information, just very quickly type into Wikipedia and go search for the thing we need and find all the information we ever possibly could have memorized and much more. So Wikipedia is a very good example of, given that short-term memory is very limited in time, given that long-term memory is powerful and quite impressive, but tends towards biases and errors of modeling, because it's very easy to completely miss a small detail, which we later need at some point in the future, but it's gone by now because we saved the main parameters and not all the details. Wikipedia plugs that gap. You need to know exactly who wrote the book called whatever. You can't remember the author. That's a fine detail that was gone in your long-term memory. Wikipedia will provide it with a few clicks of the keyboard or a couple questions to Cortana or a couple questions to Siri or somebody else. So Wikipedia is a very good example of a modern tool whose designers are fully addressing a major shortcoming, a major characteristic of human memory, by providing the lost detail that's often gone missing as part of the commitment to memory of events in our long-term memory. So, thank you very much for your time and your patience. I hope that today's discussions of psychophysics and memory systems, which quite often back them up, what's happening in the back room of the warehouse, I hope that these informations can be used. There's several rules of thumb, the 7 plus or minus 2, the Weber law, the Stevens law. There's several very simple practical things which most designers, or at least many designers, will be considering most of the time when they sit down and perform their daily activities. So thank you very much for your time, and be speaking with you again next week. Thank you.